The camp buzzed with activity under the dry heat of the sun. Boots stomped against the dirt, voices barked orders, rifles clattered against metal, and yet she moved slowly, almost too slowly for their liking. Her frame looked small beneath the heavy, packer steps, dragging as though the weight of the world bore down on her. Shoulders leaned together, whispers carried across the lines of soldiers, the word dead weight, spoken with contempt and sharp laughter. They saw no fire in her eyes, no strength. In her movements only the image of someone who had no place among them. But her silence was stronger than their mockery, and it left a question unspoken. The colonel eyed her with visible irritation, his mouth curling into a sneer as though her very presence insulted the purpose of the unit. He called her out in front of them, his voice booming across the yard, demanding to know why she moved like a ghost, why she wasted their time with weakness. She said nothing, her lips pressed tight, her eyes, cold and distant. The silence rattled him more than words might have, as though she carried secrets she refused to reveal. The men laughed again, trying to break the tension with cruel humor, but each joke rang hollow against the weight of her quiet defiance. That evening, drills tore into them, hard runs across the barren stretch of desert push-ups until muscles screamed endless repetitions that tested lungs and spirit alike. She stumbled more than once, and every stumble earned another laugh. From the men, each fall left her knees bruised, her palms bloodied, and still she rose without speaking. Not a cry, not a curse, not a plea. Her silence grew heavier with every repetition, unsettling those who wanted to hate her, but found themselves pulled by the strange gravity of her refusal to break. The medic watched closely, his eyes narrowing with suspicion, as though he recognized the shape of something hidden beneath her weakness. When the sun fell and the fires burned low, the soldiers gathered around, trading stories of combat and survival, boasting of their scars and kills. She sat apart in the shadows, her arms folded, her gaze fixed on the ground. They mocked her again, calling her decoration, not soldier, claiming she was nothing, more than a liability in uniform. One reached for her wrist, intending to drag her into their circle, to force her humiliation, but his hand froze mid-air as the firelight caught something beneath her sleeve. A faint sequence of etched numbers shimmered. Against her skin, burned deep into flesh like an unspoken code, and his laughter died in his throat. The others leaned forward, their amusement turning to confusion, their whispers sharp with curiosity. What was that, they asked, their voices no longer mocking but uneasy. She pulled her sleeve back down slowly, her face calm as stone, her silence unbroken. Yet the brief glimpse had already set their nerves on edge. Numbers carved with precision like a language only few could understand. Not tattoos, not decoration, but something colder, something lethal. The medic's eyes narrowed further. His breath caught as though he had seen those numbers before in places the others could never imagine. He said nothing, but his silence spoke louder than words, and it left the men restless. By morning, the whispers had spread through the camp like wildfire. They called her dead weight still, but the word no longer carried the same sting now. It was laced with something else, fear perhaps, or doubt. They wanted to ask about the numbers, but none dared approach her directly. The colonel demanded answers again, his patience thin, his pride wounded by her unshakable silence. She met his gaze without flinching, without word or excuse, and the tension between them stretched like wire ready to snap. The medic watched from the side, his fists clenched as though preparing for the moment when truth could no longer be denied. The day's drills grew harsher, the colonel driving them with merciless intent, determined. To break her in front of the men, he made her carry double the weight, forced her through the mud, dragged her to the front of every run. Her body trembled with exhaustion, her breaths shallow and strained, yet her silence remained. She did not give. Him, the satisfaction of a sound, not even in pain. Her sleeve slipped once as she lifted the weight again, and the numbers etched on her wrist flashed in the sunlight. The men saw it clearly this time, the code impossible to mistake for anything ordinary, and their whispers turned to fear. By dusk, the colonel confronted her before them all, his voice shaking with fury. He demanded to know what the code meant, demanded to know who she was and why she carried marks no soldier should bear. She did not. Answer, her face unreadable, her silence heavier than stone. The man leaned in breathless as the medic stepped closer, his voice low but certain. He asked her one question, not an order, not a demand. Simply a quiet question. Where did you learn to fight? Her eyes flickered for the first time at his words, her silence trembling, not broken, but alive, and the men felt the air shift as though something buried was about to rise. The air in the camp thickened after the medic spoke, the men staring at her, with wide eyes waiting for a sound, waiting for some answer that would break the silence. She only looked at him, her expression unreadable, her eyes dark with memories no one else could touch. The colonel's jaw clenched as rage filled the silence that weighed on him like chains. He barked again, demanding she explain herself, demanding she reveal what those numbers meant and why she carried them on her flesh. Still, she gave nothing, no word, no explanation, only silence that stretched into something sharper than defiance, and the men leaned forward, caught in its grip. The colonel ordered punishment drills, furious at being ignored, furious that the men looked at her instead of him. They ran through the sand until their bodies screamed with pain, until throats went dry and muscles refused to move. Yet she endured every step, carrying her pack without complaint, her silence louder than the colonel's orders. The medic kept his eyes on her, noting the way she shifted her weight, the way her hands steadied the rifle as though it were more than a weapon, but a part of her. He began to understand that the numbers on her wrist were not decoration, but instruction, something carved into her with purpose, and the thought left him cold, that night. The soldiers whispered louder, no longer, mocking but unsettled. Some claimed she was a deserter, marked by enemies. Others swore the code was military, a kill sequence reserved for the most secret operations. The colonel overheard their whispers, his fury turning into something closer to fear, because deep down he too had recognized the possibility of the numbers meaning something real. He told himself she was weak, useless, dead weight, but doubt gnawed at him with every silent look she gave. The medic sat close to the fire, his eyes never leaving her, as though waiting for the moment she would finally break. The following day, the colonel decided to test her in a way she could not endure. He set up a live fire exercise across a stretch of desert riddled with obstacles. He ordered her to run it alone, carrying a full pack under fire while the others watched. His intent was clear: to humiliate her in front of the men, to show them she was nothing more than dead weight. She stepped forward, without hesitation, her silence as unshaken as the ground beneath her boots. The men held their breath as she began to move her figure, weaving between cover with a speed and precision that shocked them. Bullets cracked across the desert, kicked up, dust and rang against metal, but she moved like water flowing through gaps invisible to untrained eyes, her pack heavy, her body weary, yet her movements flawless. Each dive, each crawl, each shot deliberate. The medic watched in awe, recognizing training. No ordinary soldier received training he had seen once before in a different life on missions no one spoke of. The men gasped as she reached the end without a scratch, her silence more deafening than the gunfire that had filled the desert moments. Later she stood tall at the finish, her eyes fixed on the colonel, who now looked away. That night the fire flickered, and the men sat in uneasy silence, glancing at her from time to time. They no longer dared to call her dead weight, no longer dared to laugh, for they had seen something none of them could explain. One of them whispered about the numbers again, asked aloud what kind of person would carry a kill code on their wrist. The medic answered, not with certainty, but with a quiet voice that cut through the night, saying only that those codes did not belong to regular soldiers. The words hung heavy in the air, pressing down on them all as they looked at her. The colonel erupted with fury, declaring it nonsense, swearing that no soldier under his command would ever carry such marks. He shouted that she was weak, that she was a liar, that her silence was nothing but fear. Yet no one echoed his words, no one laughed or nodded in agreement. Their silence matched hers, their eyes fixed on her as if waiting for the truth to reveal itself. The colonel saw his authority slipping like sand through fingers, and desperation flared in his eyes. His anger would not rest until he forced her to reveal what she hid, and he swore the truth would come tomorrow. When morning came, he announced a new trial, more brutal than before, a night march through the canyon without food, without rest, burdened with full gear, and watched closely by him. She would lead, he said, and if she faltered, he would strip her of everything before the men. She adjusted her pack calmly, her silence unbroken, though her eyes flickered toward the medic for only a second. The medic nodded once, a silent exchange of understanding that no one else caught. The march began into the shadows of the canyon, the men following her steps. And though none spoke, all felt the truth pressing closer and closer, waiting to strike. The canyon walls rose high around them, casting long shadows as the unit pressed forward under the weight of their gear. The colonel barked commands from the rear, his voice sharp against the silence, but no one answered for. Their eyes remained fixed on her. She moved with steady steps, her breathing, even her posture unshaken, though the ground beneath was rough and the march relentless. The medic studied her every motion, seeing signs that her training ran deeper than any of them could guess. And the men began to notice too, though none dared speak it aloud. They followed her into the darkness of the canyon, knowing instinctively that the night would not let them leave untouched. Hours dragged by, and the air grew colder, the canyon twisting, like a maze of stone. The colonel forced them harder, refusing breaks, refusing water, his fury still burning against the quiet defiance she carried. Yet she never slowed, not once, and the men began to draw strength from her presence, even as exhaustion pressed down like chains. One by one, their thoughts shifted away from calling her dead weight, and toward the question that haunted them all, what had carved those numbers into her flesh. The medic saw the colonel watching her too, his eyes no longer filled with contempt, but with something far more dangerous, a fear he would not name aloud. The silence broke when a crack echoed through the canyon, a sound too sharp to be stone, a gunshot ripping the night. The men froze their weapons, raised their hearts hammering, but she did not pause. Instead, she dropped into cover behind a jagged rock, motioning with one hand for the rest to follow. The colonel shouted for order, furious that she dared give direction, yet the men obeyed her without hesitation, instinct driving them to trust her stillness and her eyes that seemed to cut through the dark. Another shot rang out sparks, bouncing from the canyon wall, and the truth settled heavy on them all. They were not alone. The medic crawled close to her, whispering if she knew where the threat was coming from. She gave no reply, only pointed to the high ridge where faint glimmers moved shadows, shifting like predators on the hunt. The men gripped their rifles. The colonel cursed under his breath, but she remained calm, her silence an anchor against the chaos. Then she lifted her sleeve, pulling it back to expose the numbers etched into her wrist. The medic's breath caught as he recognized them, coordinates and sequences he had seen only once, in the black files reserved for the most dangerous missions. Her silence had been her shield, but now it became their only chance of survival. The men whispered nervously around her, asking what the code meant, asking if she had been part of something they were never told. The colonel snarled that it was a lie, a trick. Yet his voice trembled, and his eyes betrayed the truth that he too recognized what those numbers could unleash. He ordered her to explain, demanded she reveal what she knew, but still, she gave nothing, only her silence and the way her hand hovered near her weapon. The shadows on the ridge shifted again, and the men realized with dawning fear that they were surrounded their training, nothing compared to what loomed above them. Suddenly, a burst of fire erupted from the ridge bullets, tearing into the canyon walls as stones splintered and dust filled the air. The men ducked, scrambled for cover, their formation collapsing under the sudden assault. The colonel roared for them to hold, yet his words fell apart in the chaos. Then she moved, rising from cover, her rifle steady, her body sliding into a stance that none of them had ever seen before. Each shot she fired cut the air with precision, dropping shadow after shadow. From the ridge, the men stared in disbelief, unable to comprehend how someone they had called dead weight could fight like this. The medic shouted at her, demanding to know who she was, how she had learned to kill like that, but she only kept firing, her silence unbroken as bodies fell from above. The men began firing too, rallying around her presence, their fear shifting into something close to awe. She moved faster than their eyes could follow, rolling from cover to cover, her shots never wasted, her movements perfect. She had become the one thing between them and death, and the code on her wrist no longer seemed like a mystery, but a warning, a reminder that she was not what she appeared. When the gunfire faded, the canyon fell silent, except for the ragged breath of the men. The ridge above was littered with bodies, dark forms, sprawled against the rocks. The colonel staggered forward, his face pale, his authority shattered as he realized the truth he had tried to deny. She stood there, in silence, her rifle cooling in her hands, her wrist still marked with the numbers none could ignore. The medic met her eyes again, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. He knew those numbers meant she had belonged to something hidden, something lethal, something that had no place in ordinary wars. And yet she said nothing. The men waited for her to speak, waited for some explanation for what they had just seen, but her silence stretched into the night, heavier than steel. The colonel tried to bark an order, tried to reclaim the command slipping from him, but the men no longer looked at him. They looked only at her. In that moment, she had become their leader, though she had never asked for it, though she had never spoken a word. And as the wind howled through the canyon, they all knew the truth was only beginning to surface. The numbers on her wrist were not just a code. They were a promise, and promises always come due. The canyon lay silent after the firefight. The men huddled together, their eyes drawn to her more than to the colonel, who paced furiously in the sand. His authority slipped like water through his fingers, and he knew it, but pride held him upright. He barked commands, forcing the men to regroup, demanding reports and ammunition checks. Yet their responses were slow, hesitant, their gazes never leaving her. She stood apart, her rifle balanced against her shoulder, her wrist still exposed where the numbers burned into their thoughts. The medic studied her with quiet intensity, knowing that what she had revealed was not the whole truth, but only the edge of something deeper. The colonel decided that night he would break her once and for all. He ordered her into the center of the camp, demanding she explain the code that twisted the men against him. She gave nothing, not a word, not a glance, just the same unshaken silence that cut through him more than defiance ever could. He shouted at her, accusing her of treachery, of lies, of deception meant to tear his unit apart. Yet the men did not echo his anger. Their eyes locked on her as though she carried an unspoken authority greater than his. Every breath of silence grew heavier until even the colonel could feel it pressing into his bones. The medic stepped forward, trying to calm the storm, suggesting they needed her skills, that the numbers were not danger but protection. The colonel turned on him furious, calling him a fool, accusing him of being bewitched by silence. The men shifted uncomfortably unsure, who to follow their loyalty torn between command and instinct. The medic refused to back down his gaze, steady on the colonel before flicking back to her as if silently begging her to reveal the truth. Yet she only looked back at him with eyes that carried battles untold, leaving him no answers, only more questions. The night closed around them heavy with what had not been spoken. At dawn, the colonel put his plan into motion. He ordered a forced march deeper into the canyon, claiming they needed to outmaneuver their enemies, but his true intent burned clear in his expression. He would push her until she broke before them all, until she was stripped of the power her silence had stolen from him. The men obeyed his command, but their steps followed. Their trust guided by instinct more than orders. She led the line, her figure cutting through the morning haze, her movements unyielding, though the terrain grew harsher with each mile. The medic walked just behind her, noting every subtle motion, as if searching for the truth hidden in her silence. The canyon grew narrow, the walls towering higher as shadows deepened around them. The colonel marched behind, barking orders louder than before, as if to mask his fear, but the echoes carried strangely, the sound bouncing back like whispers of unseen watchers. The men grew uneasy, their weapons clutched tighter, their eyes darting at every shadow. She moved differently now, her posture sharper, her head tilting as though listening to sounds they could not hear. The medic noticed it too, the way her hand hovered near her rifle as if she already knew what was coming. The colonel ignored the warning signs, his anger blinding him to the danger that closed around them. They reached a choke point, where the path narrowed into a funnel of stone, forcing them into a vulnerable column. She stopped, suddenly raising her hand in silence, the universal signal to halt. The men froze instinctively, their eyes darting between her and the colonel, who shouted for them to move forward. When they hesitated, he roared louder, his voice echoing through the canyon like a beacon. She turned her head slowly, her gaze fixing on him with a weight that silenced even his fury. Then the air cracked with the unmistakable sound of distant gunfire, and the canyon erupted with shadows moving above them. Bullets rained from the cliffs, tearing into the rocks, sending shards flying through the column. The men scrambled for cover, their formation shattered by the sudden ambush. The colonel screamed for them to return fire, but panic rippled through the line as shadows closed in from all sides. She moved instantly. Her rifle raised her shots, precise and calm, as if the chaos did not touch her. The medic stayed close firing, when he could, but his eyes never left her movements, for they revealed a discipline beyond training, a rhythm that only came from endless repetition in battles no one else could imagine, the cod. The colonel's rage simmered long after the ambush, the men whispering quietly as they cleaned their weapons while their eyes flicked again and again toward her. The medic kept close to her side, watching for any crack in her silence. But she remained, unreadable, her hands steady as she worked with precision on her rifle. The code on her wrist caught the firelight, and the men could not look away from it, some whispering prayers, others murmuring rumors that it belonged to an order of soldiers no one dared name. The colonel clenched his fists. His pride shattered his voice hoarse as he vowed silently that by nightfall he would break her. The colonel gathered the men, ordering them into a semicircle around the fire, his tone sharp, his stare unyielding. He began to speak of loyalty of chain of command, of the danger of following shadows and silence instead of his orders. His words were harsh, cutting at her with accusations meant to turn the men against her. He spoke of treachery of spies, of traitors who hid behind scars and silence, waiting for the chance to strike. But the men did not answer his words. They did not move. Their eyes kept falling to her, as if they waited for her stillness to guide them more than his fury could. The medic rose slowly, interrupting the colonel, his voice calm but strong. He told the men that they were alive because of her, that without her silence and skill, they would have been cut down in the canyon. He reminded them of the numbers, the code, that even the colonel had recognized, though he denied it aloud. The colonel shouted him down, spitting rage that the medic had been bewitched by lies. The air grew thick as the men shifted uneasily, their loyalty balanced on a knife edge. She remained, unmoving, her face lit by firelight, her silence pressing heavier than the colonel's voice. Finally, the colonel snapped, ordering 2 soldiers to restrain her. His words rang sharp and absolute, but the men hesitated, their eyes flicking to her as if waiting for permission. The colonel screamed, louder veins rising in his neck, demanding obedience, threatening punishment. Still the men wavered, torn between fear of their commander and the strange gravity of her silence. The medic stepped forward, planting himself between her and the soldiers, daring the colonel to follow through. His defiance hung in the air as the colonel's hand twitched toward his sidearm, his fury boiling into something dangerous. The fire crackled louder as the men braced for what might come. Before the colonel could act a sound, cut through the night a distant thrum carried on the wind. The men stiffened, weapons in hand, their eyes scanning the canyon walls. She stood then, her movements sharp, her head tilting, as though she already knew what approached. The medic froze, recognizing the sound long before the others' rotor blades slicing the air from a machine that did not belong in this canyon. The colonel's voice faltered, his anger drowned by the growing roar above. The men looked skyward as the shadow of a helicopter drifted into view, its lights dark, its presence ghost-like against the stars. The machine hovered above the canyon for a breathless moment before a spotlight snapped on, flooding the camp with white fire. The men scattered for cover, their rifles raised, but she did not move. Instead, she lifted her wrist into the beam, the code on her skin, catching the light like a signal. The helicopter responded immediately, banking lower, its rotors tearing through the silence. The medic's stomach twisted as he realized the code was not just a mark of identity, but a key, a call that unlocked answers none of them were ready for. The colonel stared in disbelief, his face pale as he watched. The machine bow to her, a rope ladder dropped from the side of the helicopter, figures descending in black armor, their weapons sleek and unfamiliar. The men gaped, frozen between awe and terror, their rifles trembling in their hands. The colonel screamed for them to fire, to bring down the intruders, but no one obeyed. Their eyes were fixed on her as she stepped forward into the light, meeting the armored figures with a calm that confirmed what the medic had already guessed. She belonged to them, or perhaps they belonged to her. The truth lay heavy between the shadows as the colonel's voice cracked with desperation. The armored soldiers did not speak, their movements silent as they surrounded her. Their leader turned his visor toward her, raising a hand in salute, a gesture that sent shivers through the men. She returned nothing. Only silence. Her wrist still raised, her eyes sharp with unreadable intent. The medic's heart pounded, knowing he stood at the edge of a truth too vast to grasp. He had wondered about the code, and now he began to understand it was more than training, more than orders. It was allegiance to a world hidden beneath the one they knew. The colonel stumbled back, his face white as chalk, realizing what this meant. The helicopter's blades thundered above the camp, drowning all sound, until she lowered her wrist and the light clicked off. The armored soldiers turned their weapons outward, guarding the camp, rather than threatening it, as though she had given silent command. The medic stared at her, desperate for answers, but still she offered none. The colonel's fury broke into something close to madness, his voice straining as he declared she was the enemy, that she would destroy them all. But his words fell flat against the silence that held the camp, the silence that belonged to her alone. The men no longer looked at him. They looked only at her. The night deepened, the helicopter hovering overhead, the armored soldiers standing guard, the camp divided. Between fear and awe, she stood at the center, her rifle slung at her side, her wrist marked with the code that had brought shadows from the sky. The medic felt the truth tightening around him, though he could not yet name it. He knew she carried a past written in silence, a past that now reached into the present to claim them all. The colonel knew it too, his eyes wild with desperation as he plotted his final move. And as the fire burned low, the men felt the storm was not ending but only beginning. The night pressed heavy over the canyon. The fire burned low. The helicopter's blades still thrummed above, and the armored soldiers remained statues in the shadows. The men huddled together, whispering their fear and confusion, while their eyes never strayed far from her. She stood in the center, unmoving, her wrist still marked by the code that had summoned ghosts from the sky. The medic could feel the tension straining tighter with every breath. He watched her in silence, hoping she would finally give the truth he had been chasing. But her face gave nothing away, only the calm of someone who had walked through fire and carried its scars. The colonel's voice cut suddenly through the air, jagged and furious. He shouted that this was proof, that she was a traitor, that she had lured them here to their deaths. He demanded the men raise their weapons and fire to end her silence once and for all. Yet no soldier moved, their rifles remained low, their gazes fixed not on him but on her. They had seen too much. They had felt her presence in the battle. They had survived because of her, not him. The colonel's face twisted with rage. His authority shattered his words, no longer carried the weight of command. Only the desperation of a man drowning in his own fear. The medic stepped closer to her, his voice steady, though his chest hammered. He asked her plainly who she was and what the code meant. He told her the men deserved to know the truth, that silence would tear them apart even if it had saved them so far. Still she did not speak, only lifted her wrist higher, letting the firelight glint across the numbers etched deep in her skin. The medic stared at the sequence and felt a chill as pieces began to align with fragments he remembered. From hidden files, the code was not just identity, it was activation, and the thought left his mouth dry. The colonel saw the medic's hesitation and seized on it, roaring that she was a weapon, not a soldier, that she was here to destroy them all. He drew his sidearm, leveling it at her, his hand shaking with fury. The men froze, the air thick as they stared at their commander, finally willing to kill one of his own. The armored soldiers did not move, but their weapons shifted subtly toward the colonel. The medic shouted for him to stop, but the colonel ignored him, his finger trembling on the trigger. Her eyes locked on the colonel, steady and cold, and in that silence the canyon itself seemed to wait in a single motion. She lifted her rifle, not to fire, but to hold it across her chest like a barrier. Her wrist turned the code visible to the colonel, who froze mid-breath. His face blanched as recognition dawned. His hand lowered slightly, his voice faltering into disbelief. He whispered, words the men could not hear, but the medic caught them. Words that spoke of a program buried deep, erased from record, but not from memory. The colonel had known of it once long ago, and now, standing before him, was proof, living proof, that the program had not been erased after all. The colonel's weapon wavered, but his madness did not end. Suddenly a flare burst across the sky, lighting the canyon in harsh white glow. The armored soldiers turned their visors upward, signaling the helicopter with swift hand gestures. The medic realized with horror that this was not rescue. It was retrieval. She was not here by accident. She had been placed here and now. The code had been answered. The men stared wide-eyed, understanding that her silence had not been choice, but duty, a duty tied to something none of them could escape. The colonel screamed again, refusing to accept it, refusing to let go of the last shred of control in his grip. He lunged forward, his weapon still raised, aiming for her chest. But the armored soldiers moved faster. In a blur, they disarmed him, forcing him to his knees, their rifles pressing against his head. The men gasped, torn between shock and relief, while the colonel spat curses at them all. His eyes locked.